Rain lashed against the cracked visor of the helmet, its rhythmic patter the only sound that filled the dense grayness. She had stopped counting the hours since the crash. Perhaps it had only been 3, perhaps 30. The concept of time had quickly lost shape amidst the downpour and debris. The ship was a smoking wound in the earth behind her, its skeletal remains twisted and silent. She was the only one who had emerged alive, and barely at that. Mira crouched beside a smoldering panel, her fingers trembling as they tore away at the harness buckle that had gouged into her ribs during the descent. Her breath came in short bursts, white mist curling out into the cold air. The sky above was bruised steel, unyielding and soaked in an endless storm. She tasted blood in her mouth, but it was a silence that gnawed at her. There was no response from the comms, no emergency beacon blinking through the smoke. The planet had swallowed them whole, and it seemed no one noticed. Her boots sank ankle-deep into the saturated earth as she stood, wobbling under her own weight. She looked out across the clearing, past the wreckage and into the forest of muted shapes, all cloaked in moss and rain. The land felt ancient, untouched, like it had been waiting for centuries to be disturbed. Off to the side, nestled among the shadows, stood the strange domes, half-submerged, grown over, weather-beaten. They looked like giant woven baskets tipped onto their sides. One had collapsed entirely, vines creeping through its broken ribs. Another still stood, leaning, its entrance barely visible through the sheets of rain. Mira approached cautiously. Every step was an argument against exhaustion. Her training, what little applied in situations like this, urged her to remain calm, observe, adapt. But all she could think of was how the cold had seeped through her suit, how the weight of silence and water pressed down on her until she felt like drowning on land. Inside the dome, the air was warmer, dry even. The storm faded to a muffled hum outside, as if she had stepped underwater. The interior was dark, lit only by the pale glow of her helmet lamp. Then she saw them. Figures, curled and still, lay embedded in nests of fibrous material. Not human. Their bodies were slight, limbs too long, heads smooth and featureless save for 2 recessed hollows where eyes might have been. They lay as if asleep, unmoving, untouched by the chaos outside. One breathed. She could tell by the slight rise and fall of its chest beneath translucent skin. Another emitted a soft, rhythmic pulse from its neck, a bioluminescent heartbeat that cast eerie shadows on the walls. She backed out of the dome slowly, heart pounding. They hadn't noticed her, or didn't care. Either way, she wasn't ready for answers. The realization hit her with full force as she stumbled into the rain again. No one was coming. The ship's emergency systems were fried. The beacon was gone. There was no signal. The suit would keep her alive for another 12 hours, maybe 15 before power ran out. And then, exposure, hunger, or worse. The storm showed no sign of ending. The air here tasted metallic, like rust and ozone. Her lips were chapped, her fingers numb. There was no food, no fire, and not a single tool she could salvage from the wreckage. What she had now was what she had, and it wasn't enough. She collapsed to her knees beside a broken support beam and let out a breath that wasn't quite a scream. It was too tired for that. She looked down at her hands, mud-caked, bleeding, nails cracked from prying open storage compartments. The rain washed the blood away only to reveal more beneath. Her body was already giving in. She pressed her forehead to the cold metal and whispered to no one, "I don't want to die here." But the planet didn't care. At some point, instinct took over. She began crawling, dragging herself toward the smallest of the domes, the only one that seemed uninhabited. It leaned like a tired animal, its entrance just wide enough to squeeze through. Inside it smelled of earth and rot, but it was dry. She collapsed there, her body curling into itself. The storm outside continued, steady and merciless. When she opened her eyes again, darkness had deepened. She didn't remember falling asleep. Hunger stabbed at her ribs, but it was the cold that woke her. Her suit had lost heat. She had to move, do something, anything. With no tools, no light, she began digging into the floor with her fingers. The material was soft and wet, organic. The dome had been built with fibers, woven reeds or something like them, now reinforced with clay or moss. She ran her fingers over the structure, feeling its contours, learning its form like a blind sculptor. It was primitive, but it had endured the storm. If she could understand it, she could rebuild it. Not perfect, but enough to live through the night. Outside, the landscape was littered with shapes. Most were bodies, crew, unrecognizable now, but some weren't human. Mira didn't let herself look too closely. The dead couldn't help her, and she wasn't ready to face whatever the aliens were or had been. The thought that they might awaken both frightened and comforted her. At least then, she would be the only conscious thing here. She found a length of cable among the wreckage and began fashioning a frame. Bent branches, split metal struts, scraps of carbon plate. Nothing elegant, everything soaked. Her fingers moved from muscle memory, tasks repeated from old survival drills. She lashed parts together with stripped insulation wire. Her movements were sluggish but focused, trance-like. Twice, the structure collapsed. Once under its own weight, once when the wind caught it. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply started again. The rain lessened by dawn, though the sky never brightened. Still, the shift in sound was enough to give her hope. She returned to the dome and scavenged more fiber from its edges. It tore easily in long, matted strands. She wrapped them around the skeleton she had built, layering for insulation, stuffing the gaps with moss and mud. By midday, she had something that barely stood, but it held. She crawled inside, curled up in the center, and for the first time since the crash, she closed her eyes and didn't wake up shivering. She didn't think about rescue. Not yet. Outside, the alien bodies remained in their sleep. Mira watched them from the shadow of her new shelter, unsure whether they were gods, ghosts, or something else entirely. They had shelter. They had peace. And yet they slept as if the world wasn't ending. She didn't have that luxury. She wasn't a god. She wasn't a ghost. She was human, and she was still alive. Myra's fingers were raw, her nails broken and caked with dirt, but she didn't stop working. The makeshift shelter, little more than a bent exosuit frame laced with moss and dry vegetation, had survived the night, barely. Water had pooled around her ankles by morning, but she hadn't frozen. That alone felt like a miracle. In the cold, indifferent world she'd been flung into, survival was no longer about hope. It was about repetition, discipline, and almost mechanical disregard for pain. Each day blurred into the next, ruled by the storm's shifting rhythms and her own endurance. Food was a gnawing ache she ignored, her body burning through its reserves. She found nothing edible in the wild, nothing familiar. Even the moss had a bitter metallic smell that warned her off. For now, water was the only resource she could rely on. She collected it in concave scraps of metal, watched it drip like liquid glass into the rusted cavities, and drank it slowly, savoring each mouthful. The aliens remained undisturbed. Mira checked them twice a day, morning and night, as if making rounds in a sleeping ward. She didn't know why. Perhaps it grounded her, made her feel less alone. They hadn't moved. Their stillness was unsettling, too perfect, too intentional. Some emitted faint pulses of light along their spines, like signals sent in dreams. Others remained dim and silent. She had counted 7 total, each cocooned in an individual pod built into the woven dome structures. Some pods had collapsed, exposing the occupants to wind and moisture. Those were already beginning to decay. She didn't approach those anymore. Instead, she returned to the dome she claimed for herself. It was smaller, almost cozy now that she'd spent hours reinforcing it. She found herself studying its architecture. The outer layer, composed of fiber strands, had been woven in overlapping spirals, clearly deliberate. Beneath, a mud-like substance hardened when exposed to the air, forming a kind of organic cement. It wasn't just primitive, it was brilliant. Whoever or whatever had built these domes had understood shelter at an instinctive level. Myra's second structure went up faster than the first. She built it beside the original, wider and more stable. She used what she'd learned, angled supports, double-layered insulation, drainage channels carved into the floor. It wasn't beautiful, but it was strong. She dragged the surviving crate from the ship's wreckage and stored it inside, sealing it with vines and strips of her ruined uniform. It was all instinct now, all need. Shelter first. Shelter always. Tools became the next problem. She had nothing to cut with, nothing to dig or pry. Her hands were the first tools. Then bones, human or alien, she didn't check too closely. She sharpened one against a jagged panel from the engine bay and used it like a knife. Another she lashed to a broken strut to make a crude spear, not for hunting, but for leverage, for balance, for something that felt like control. At night, she lay awake listening to the wind scream across the open ground, her thoughts drifting like ash. She imagined herself as the last ember in a dead world, waiting to go out. She didn't cry. Crying required hope. She just breathed and listened and watched the rain slide down the curves of her shelter. On the seventh day, the storm broke for the first time. The silence afterward was almost violent. No wind, no rain, just a faint hum of unfamiliar wildlife and the distant groaning of shifting trees. The clouds hung low and heavy, like bruises on the sky, but there was light, gray and cold, but light all the same. Mira stepped outside, blinking against the change. The land revealed itself in pieces. Twisted hills coated in moss, skeletal trees with no leaves, a river of black water winding in the distance, and near the horizon, far beyond the wreckage, structures. More domes, possibly, or something else. Her instinct screamed to stay. Stay by the shelter. Stay near the known. But something deeper pulled her forward. Curiosity? Desperation? It didn't matter. She packed what little she had. Water, a bundle of fiber rope, her bone knife, and a strip of fabric she'd marked with notches for days survived. She left before noon, marking her trail with stones. The land was treacherous. Soggy ground swallowed her ankles. Branches tore her sleeves. Once, she slipped into a pit and nearly didn't climb back out. But she made it. The structures were domes, larger than the ones near the crash site. Abandoned mostly. Some caved in, others intact. A few held sleeping aliens, just like before, but one was different. It was stripped bare inside, the floor carved with lines and grooves, as if someone had once written something there and then tried to erase it. There were no occupants, no pods, just emptiness and dust. But the space felt wrong, like it remembered voices. Mira turned away quickly, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. Back at camp, she began building again, faster, better, with materials from the new site. She wove tight mats from reeds, sealed walls with thick mud. She learned how to use heat from chemical packs in the emergency rations to harden the walls, baked the mud into stone. The shelters took on a rhythm, a pattern. With each one she built, her movements grew surer, more precise. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was engineering. Days became a routine. Wake, collect water, check the aliens, gather material, reinforce, repeat. She spoke aloud sometimes, mostly to herself, sometimes to them. Told them about the wind last night, about how the new support beam held. Told them she might try building higher, maybe even a roof vent. They never answered. But speaking made her feel less like she was vanishing. Then came the shift. One of the aliens moved. She hadn't seen it happen. Only the aftermath. A subtle change in posture, a finger curl that hadn't been before. A faint glow in the ribs. She stood there for a long time, unsure she was imagining it. Then she turned and left, slowly, her stomach tight with dread. That night, she fortified everything, doubled the barriers, secured the door with woven latches. She didn't sleep. She sat by the entrance with her spear across her knees, eyes fixed on the dome where the alien had stirred. Nothing happened. The wind returned around midnight, howling across the plain like a warning. In the morning, she went back. The alien hadn't moved again, yet something had changed. She began noticing signs, subtle, almost imperceptible. The air in the dome warmer than outside. Condensation on the inner surface of one pod. A new scent in the air, faintly floral, like decay and bloom. And once, just once, she thought she heard something. Soft, low, like a breath or a hum, just outside her range of understanding. Still, she worked. Her hut was nearly complete now. A stormproof structure, insulated, reinforced, capable of outlasting days of wind. It was a crowning achievement, built from scraps and suffering. She stood back and looked at it the way one might admire a sculpture. Not perfect, but alive with intent. Inside, she sat on the woven floor and let the silence settle around her. She had survived. More than that, she had built something no one had thought possible without tools or help or hope. The storm had returned outside, but it no longer mattered. Her hut held, her body held, her mind held for now. She closed her eyes just for a moment, and from somewhere in the dark, something watched. The next morning arrived without sunlight. The sky returned to its habitual state, a churning veil of smoke-gray clouds and intermittent rainfall. Mira opened her eyes slowly, disoriented. The air inside the hut was dry, unnaturally still. No wind hissed through the seams. No cold fingers clawed at her skin. She sat up sharply, something instinctive gnawing at her gut. The dome was silent, but not peaceful. There was movement beyond the thin walls, not the skittering of branches or distant animal calls. Something heavier, purposeful. She rose without a sound, wrapped her fingers around the bone spear, and stepped to the entrance, lifting the woven mat just enough to peer outside. 2 of the alien pods were open. The sight arrested her breath. They hadn't broken open. The seams were smooth, clean, retracted as if in response to signal. One pod still held its occupant, unmoving. The other 2 were empty. Mira backed away from the entrance, heart pounding. She hadn't heard them open. How long ago had it happened? Were they watching her now? The urge to run battled with her instincts to observe. She crouched and waited. Hours passed. Nothing returned. She finally stepped outside when the light had faded, a dull green-gray hue washing the plain. There were no footprints. Not that the wet ground preserved them well, but the presence lingered like an aftertaste in the air. The hut stood still, half consumed by vines and mist. Her own shelter looked unchanged, the mud walls solid, the structural angles exact. She returned to it slowly, wary. Nightfall brought unease. Mira didn't sleep. She waited with her back against the dome, spear across her lap, and when it came softly, not a shape, not a shadow, but a sound. A voice, almost. It wasn't speech in any recognizable sense. A tonal vibration, low and resonant, that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It wrapped around her like fog, pressed into her temples like a memory. She closed her eyes against it and saw them, not faces, but impressions. The aliens, awake, communing in a network of light and color and rhythm. She was among them, not by invitation, but by accident. The vision snapped away, leaving her dizzy and gasping. By morning, she was no longer afraid. Curiosity took root where fear had lived. The alien presence, whatever it was, had not harmed her, had not even approached. But they were aware of her now. Of that she was certain. Their silence was not ignorance. It was calculation, observation, and maybe, just maybe, acknowledgement. She visited the open pods in daylight. They were empty, yes, but they were not abandoned. The organic shells had begun to recluse, slowly, as if conserving their strength. There were markings inside, ridges, patterns that pulsed faintly under her touch. Not decoration, not random. Communication? She began recording them in the mud wall of her hut, sketching the shapes with her fingers, trying to recreate the rhythm she'd felt during the vision. It wasn't language she could translate, but it had form, recurrence, intent. She traced and retraced the lines, waiting, watching. On the 3rd day, they answered. A stone had been placed just outside her shelter. It hadn't been there the day before. Flat, smooth, warm despite the rain. On its surface were lines, not carved, but formed, etchings that matched the symbols she had drawn in her wall. Mira touched the stone and felt something inside her lurch. Not pain, not fear, alignment, recognition, as if the air had clicked into place around her. She carried it inside and placed it at the center of the floor, where it pulsed with faint luminescence. They were watching, and now they were speaking. The next days unfolded with purpose. She built a smaller hut, a copy of her own, beside the others. A gift, perhaps, a gesture of intent. She lined it with woven mats, left fresh water inside, and placed a stone at the center. It vanished by morning. She smiled then, the first genuine smile since the crash. It was thin and tired, but real. The connection had begun. Not friendship. She wasn't naive, but something like a truce, a shared need to endure. Then the sky changed. It began with color. Not sunrise, but something stranger, a vertical slash of red along the horizon that didn't fade. Mira climbed a nearby ridge for a better view. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. A ship, not one of theirs. Angular, sharp-edged, unnatural against the organic sprawl of the land. It hovered in silence, half shrouded in mist, far off but approaching. Myra's instinct screamed again, not in wonder, but in dread. Whoever was aboard, they weren't here to rescue. She ran back to the shelters, adrenaline igniting every nerve. She gathered what she could, tools, rope, the remaining emergency rations. The alien pods had all sealed now. No trace of the occupants, no further messages. They had gone underground, perhaps, or deeper into forest. They had hidden. She was on her own again. The ship descended slowly, methodically, not searching but scanning. Red lights painted the earth in broad, methodical sweeps. Mira fled toward the deeper woodlands, where the terrain grew dense and uneven. Her shelters, her sanctuary, were left behind. For hours, she moved through shadows, careful not to leave tracks. The ship made no sound, but she heard the buzz of drones, felt their presence overhead like wasps waiting to strike. She hid beneath tree roots, in shallow pits, beneath camouflage blankets of moss. Her pulse became a silent drum in the wet earth. When night fell, they began landing. Not men, not aliens. Machines, bipedal, faceless, clad in metal and light. They moved like predators, scanning, sweeping, ignoring anything that didn't radiate heat or motion. Mira stayed still for so long her muscles cramped into knots. She only moved again when the machines passed, unaware. She understood then these weren't search parties. They were exterminators, sent not to find survivors, but to ensure none existed. At dawn, she crept back toward the ruins of the huts. Fire had eaten through part of the plain, deliberate, controlled burns. Her first shelter was gone, scorched into skeletal remains. The secondary domes had been sliced open, gutted. No sign of the aliens. No sign of her stone. But the ground held something else. A pattern. New lines, etched into the soil in a sweeping arc. Not hers. The aliens had returned in their way, had responded, had warned. She crouched and traced the marks, heart thundering. Then she heard it. A whisper behind her ear, a presence that coiled not around her body, but within her thoughts. Not alone. The message was clear. She didn't know how she knew it, only that she did. And in that instant, everything shifted. This was no longer about her, no longer about survival. It was a reckoning. She stood up slowly, eyes fixed on the black smear of the alien ship in the sky. She was one human with no tools, no weapons, no allies, but she had built in the storm. She had learned. She had been seen. And she was not afraid. The machines would come again, and this time she would be ready.